This is Monica Perez, and here with us today is Jason Purcell, an investment advisor with a personal interest in helping households diversify away from traditional stocks and bonds. But he also likes to understand the history and complexities of money and financial markets. So he contacted me recently with an offer to explain this apparent global trend of de-dollarization, where other countries aren't using the dollar as their reserve currency anymore, and that could be crazy scary or it could be no big deal. And because I don't know the answer to that, I thought it would be super fun to talk to Jason about it. And historically, me thinking that was super fun would have been super nerdy. But I think people's interest in what's happening with the dollar is really peaking because looks like the next stop is the central bank digital currency. So I don't know if this is a stepping stone or what. I don't know. But I know that I don't know. So I want to hear it from you. And I also want you, in your own words, to kind of tell people what you do and why this is, why this is something that you can tackle. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how people can find your stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I think the best place to find me right now is probably on Twitter. I'm at SDnomics. I respond to, if you send me a message on Twitter, I will respond if you comment on my stuff while, engaging in conversation. I like Twitter a lot. It's really unhealthy. But I do enjoy it. There's always an argument to be had, which is really dangerous for somebody like me because I like to argue. So, but a little bit about me. I'm not going to mention the exact name of my employer, but you know my name. And so if you're really resourceful, you can find that information. It's really not that hard. But I work for a major non-bank financial institution. Hopefully we'll get a chance to touch on the classification of that, which is basically a shadow bank. So hopefully we'll get a chance to kind of talk about shadow banking, but it's really not that crazy. There are a lot of non-bank financial institutions that, you could literally look at that and, oh, that's a shadow bank, when you think about it. So I work for one of these major non-bank financial institutions. I'm on a small team of people who is responsible for doing what's called trade lifecycle management. So we're responsible for a notional amount in dollars, of course, but a notional amount of contracts that usually fluctuates anywhere between 350 and about $500 billion.
Is that feel like an inflated number because of derivatives and stuff like that? Is it,
That's actually, yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. So you could reduce that a little bit if you took the economic value of the derivatives rather than the notional.
But still, it's not many multiples. Because if you look at how much money there is in the world, what the world GDP is, say it's $100 trillion or something,
Mm-hmm.
It's the amount of financial instruments is in the quadrillions.
Is in the hundreds and trillions.
Yeah, or maybe maybe it's just in the hundreds of trillions, but it's just a crazy number, which is the kind of scary thing like the reserve currency that makes me wonder, are we absolutely playing on a house of cards here, or does it not even really matter because bricks and mortar is all that counts?
Yeah. Well, shoot, if you want to go down a really quick rabbit hole, I could clear a little bit of that up for you because I do deal with derivatives, and I have been for about 5 years now. So, and this is, I think, part and parcel of this conversation. When people talk about de-dollarization, they'll often mention, okay, well, there's not just all of this debt that we know about. We have about $30 trillion of U.S. debt that's outstanding. And then there's all the borrowings of the corporations in the United States. We have something like $12, $13 trillion in mortgage debt. And so people look at the U.S. and just say, oh my gosh, this is a basket case of debt. And the only reason we're able to do it is because we have the whole world conned into this system where they will buy our assets. That's how a lot of people in what I would call the liberty community tend to look at that.
Yeah, it's the petrodollar replacing the gold standard is how I think of it. And my understanding was we say we'll pay you in dollars for all the oil that you have, and you will in turn buy our treasuries so that we can be incredibly indebted but still have a fairly stable currency, is how I think about it. But I'm happy to be completely wrong.
Yeah, well, there's half of the petrodollar idea that is 100% true, which is the idea of petrodollar recycle. And that started to
Okay.
become a thing in the early 1970s.
Mhm.
And you can actually find, so I'm a big history geek. And one thing that I do when doing research for things like this is I go through the New York Times archive for the 100 and some odd years that there were actual journalists looking
Yes.
and working there, because it started in 1851. So there's a lot of stuff to work with. Um, but if you go through the archives and you look at like the early 70s,
Do you have
is
this?
that the Scylla book?
It's Sydney
Sydney
Homer.
and
Yeah.
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 I love that
Isn't that the
one.
best? I asked her it for Christmas one
Yeah.
year and I got like whatever earrings from Tiffany instead. I was like, come on.
Oh shoot. That's not a good book.
Anyway, but yes. So history of I can totally relate to finding that fascinating. It is. I mean, it's those
Yeah.
little. There was a guy on my show recently, Shane Cashman, who said he likes to take the cubist approach to history, like look at things from all different angles, and you get a totally different picture. And I wouldn't even know where to begin of the angles to look at, but that's a great place to kind of flesh out some of the shadows in our kind of historical narrative. So, okay, go ahead. So in the early 70s,
Yeah.
and then, but it went back, you said, to the
Yeah.
1800s? What went back to the 1800s?
The New York Times archive does.
Mhm.
So if you want to just read some really old stuff, just go and get I think it comes with a membership in the New York Times, which I understand for a lot of people
Yes.
that's hard to justify paying for because they're awful. But there's a lot of good
Well,
stuff.
the
in the
archives are, yes. And what surprises
Yeah.
me sometimes is when I look at old articles, how blatantly propagandistic they still are, and also how much they resemble what is said today. Like, I mean, some of the same issues are
Yeah.
treated with the same talking points. And I just think this is a function of the fact that human beings only like stay cognitive for like 60 years.
Yeah, and then we forget everything from the previous generation or maybe
totally.
2 generations ago, and we just do
Yes.
the same thing over and
Yes,
over
the memory
again.
hole. Yeah, it's hilarious. And it's just, I just think of that, like, we would just stop. I'm not even that old. I'm not even, 100 years old, but I'm already like, oh my gosh, I've heard, are they literally doing the whole debt government shutdown thing again? People are like, what do you think about that? It's like, what do I think about? I don't think about it. I'm not thinking about that.
Yeah, Dave Smith had a great bit about that where he's like, if they shut down the National Park Service, I don't think the bears out in the national parks are saying, I don't know, did you get an email? Apparently they're not running the services today. I don't know what's going on.
It's like COVID if you didn't have a screen.
Yeah,
Okay,
if you
go
didn't
ahead.
have the
Yes.
internet, you didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Or the television.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, truly.
Yep.
So this was that what I was reflecting was the kind of meme of the 70s, right? So
Yeah.
and I agree. Like okay, so you validated the idea of recycling into our debt, right?
Huge.
And then,
huge.
but you feel like there's a piece of what I said that is not valid.
Well, it may not even necessarily be what you said. The typical construct of the petrodollar idea that I hear is that, okay, in 1971, Nixon pisses everybody off by going off the gold standard. The reason that people like the dollar in the first place is because it is tied to gold. It's the only currency left in the world that is at that point. So it's the only one that's convertible. But if you get rid of that, then you have all of these people around the world who are now saying, okay, well, why should I, Saudi Arabia, for example, is now saying, okay, well, why should I accept dollars for oil? And so there's this idea out there, which I have really, really searched high and low to find evidence for. But there's this idea, and I've read all these different articles and I've looked at their SIS that claim to explain, how the petrodollar system came to be. And the key piece of it that I dispute is that there's an idea that sometime in the 1970s, maybe 1974, that the Americans and the Saudis came together and they met and they devised an agreement whereby the Saudis would exclusively price and sell oil in dollars, right, in exchange for basically being a member of the U.S. protectorate, which the Saudi Arabia is, right? Like that's why we.
I'd say they get to blow up buildings and stuff and
get
and jetted off the scene or collaborate to blow up buildings. Let's just say.
Right.
Anyway.
And that's one of the many reasons, or actually it is the primary reason why we've been at war, why we've been supporting a war in Yemen since 2016 or
Oh,
whenever,
isn't
is
that
that
it's a
U.S.-Saudi
truly an
relationship.
atrocity. Yes, terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the piece. So that's the piece of it that I can't find any evidence for. We also have some of the notes, some of the documents about Kissinger's time from that era as Secretary of State, and they do talk about the dollar system. They talk about trying to wean the rest of the world off of gold. They talk about who their allies are in that whole equation. Yeah.
Do they say why they want to wean the world off gold?
Well, because if people want to redeem their dollars for gold, then they will accumulate the gold. And the advantage that the United States comes out of World War II with is that they have 2/3 of the world's gold. And so if they can convince the rest of the world that they don't need to actually redeem their dollars to get gold, then they can essentially control the world's financial system, or they can use the Fed and the Treasury to control monetary policy for the rest of the world, as long as there's no um, call on that option to
Right.
redeem their dollars
So if
for
there's
gold.
no accountability mechanism,
There's no anchor.
Right.
Ultimately,
Okay.
there's no anchor.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no limit.
Right. And maybe they feel that gold has inherent value and they wanted to stop the music when they had it all. Right.
Maybe they just wanted to hold on to it. Yeah. And I do believe that ultimately, why does any government go away from gold? So if you look at each of the examples where a country has gone from having convertibility to gold to not having convertibility to gold, do you want to take a guess at what the primary cause is? I bet you could probably guess because you know enough.
To
So
leave the gold standard?
yeah. Why would a country go from converting to not converting?
Well, our reason was they had inflated, right? Too much. There was too much. They didn't want to give it all away, right?
Yeah, so that's the most
I
recent
mean, I would
one.
say debt,
If you look before
debt.
that, it's war, which is debt. You need to
Oh,
borrow a lot of money to
greenbacks,
go to
like the
war.
Civil War.
Exactly.
Yes,
Yes. Yes.
exactly. Yes,
Right.
yes.
So U.S.
Oh,
dollar was
yeah,
convertible to gold
exactly.
from 1790 all the way up until 1861, and then it wasn't. And why wasn't it? Because the federal administration under Lincoln and his Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, who was kind of an evil genius. Anyway, um, but they didn't want to convert to gold because they needed it. Okay, the federal government needed all of the monetary gold in the country so that they could pay the Europeans to bring in all of these war goods so that they could subject the South. And then
So interesting. So there's two kinds of dollars. There's domestic dollars and there's foreign dollars. Like what you're saying is it didn't even have to be in two different colors, but it was like they called them greenbacks. But what you're saying is there was like gold was the international currency and they could just domestically screw people with this. And
literally, yeah.
That's what's scary about, that's what I think is scary, whether it's really true or not, but what's scary about the idea of losing reserve status is that all those dollars that are out in the world making transactions that don't involve us would come rushing back, and we could still produce what was produced within our borders. But our actual dollars you'd need 10 times as many to bring anything in because it no longer if it no longer had the demand for the outside goods, there would just be a vast oversupply. Right? Is that kind of what sounds scary about it, or not?
Yeah, and I would even summarize that to say that let's say that your currency becomes weaker against other currencies for whatever reason, right? One specific example I hope we'll get to is the Mexican peso in the 1980s. Mexican peso, it's pegged to the dollar up until I think 1982, and then they devalue it, and then they eventually just the Mexican government has to let it float because there's so much pressure on the currency. they have a great deal of dollar debts that cannot be repaid. And so the markets naturally, well, two things. There are traders who will bet against that. And so the markets will turn against the peso. But there's also just the sheer fact that if the Mexican economy is going into the toilet, then there's not as much need for the peso around the world. And so the currency is going to fall in demand. How much that affects your domestic inflation rate, I would say depends on how well diversified your economy is. How much stuff are you able to produce at home?
Yeah, so I just want to say that, like, when Trump was encouraging manufacturing at home, I'm like, that makes no sense because we don't have a comparative advantage in manufacturing. We are not going to make things cheaper, better than other countries who, we should stick to like building computers and making movies is the economic, libertarian economic theory would say that. Unless I said maybe he's going autarky, which is he wants to bring stuff inside so that if we have a war, we can produce things. But I dismissed that idea because I thought, well, that would mean that the powers that be who are driving this care about us and want to win this war. But maybe it's just that they are, in that one case, they would want the quote us, which would include them, to win the war. But so I'd love for you to address what you think was going on with Trump doing that. Or with this movement to bring, or even, it could have been just pure politics and maybe that didn't even occur to you, but.
Yeah. Oh man, it's really hard to tell with him.
I assume it was somebody else driving it. So I wouldn't try to figure out his personality. I would just say, why do you think, was it a real or fake thing? Did it really happen? I wonder if we actually have more manufacturing now than we did 6 years ago. I don't know. I'd have to. Well, and of course, COVID, like the COVID factor screws up all the cause and effect. I have to talk to you about that too. Sure. Sorry. I'm all over the place. I'm super sorry. I meant not to do that. I'm not going to do it. I'm loving it.
I'm on like 3 or 4 hours of sleep myself, so I think it's going to be a really fun conversation.
You need
at least
espresso.
For us. I don't know if your listeners will get much value.
I'm very smart and frenetic listeners who obviously can follow me going all over the place because they always do it. But I do want to ask you later about COVID. But so did I even jump the gun in asking you about the petrodollar? We're not there yet, right?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, we're kind of not there yet, but it doesn't. We can go in any order. It doesn't really matter. So,
what's the backstory? What got us to that point? Like, there's a first half of the history, and then you sent me some blurb that, like, some bullet points. Which,
I think the natural starting point is probably. The natural starting point is probably with the sterling market, which really got going in the 1850s. And since we were talking about countries going off of gold convertibility to fight wars, something that happened in England in 1797 is that they did drop convertibility to, I believe that the pound sterling was more commonly converted into sterling silver at that point rather than gold. So they did drop convertibility in order to go to war. They maintained that setup in order to fight the Napoleonic Wars. So that's the late 700s all the way up until the 18 teens. I think maybe 1820. And then they did actually end up restoring convertibility in 1821. So you could look at Britain at this point and, like, let's say that you are, a business person or a banker or something, and you've got some balances of excess money that you want to put to work. Where is it going to be invested and in what currency? You could look at that and say, well, look at how profligate London is, right? They went off the gold standard, or they went off their silver convertibility in order to pay for this war, and it took them, 25 years to reinstate it. But and that's a decent point, okay? And in 1850, you've only got 30 years of convertibility there. That's not exactly a huge long history. But on the other hand, that setup is actually a lot better than the rest of Europe. So, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, most of the countries in Europe are kind of at war with each other, and they're all debasing their currencies in order to fight these wars. That's just what they do, and Admittedly, I don't know as much about the specific wars of Europe over those centuries as I should. I was realizing that actually in preparing for this podcast, is that I would really like to go in and kind of get a mental working memory of like, okay, from this year to this year, it was the Franco-Prussian War, and this was when the first Anglo-Dutch War, and this is when the second Anglo-Dutch War was, and all this stuff. But I just don't know enough about it. But the phrase for that we now use for the United States is it's the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry, right? So of
Ouch.
course, yeah. So of course, London, the crown is profligate. They will drop convertibility in order to go to war, sure, but everybody else is going to do the same thing. So your question is, as far as what currency am I going to store my balances in? What currency am I going to invest in? It's not which one is the best, which one is really, which of these governments is going to protect me, it's which one is the least bad.
Well, I guess I would say there were two other ways I would look at it, which I guess the least bad is one of the ways, which is which one's going to remain standing, and will they still have that currency, or will they give you a new peso or whatever? And then the alternative is trade and store of value and stuff actually is in goods or gold, so that you can't use the currency, I would think.
Yeah.
Because I think of like the ruble and the yuan or renminbi or whatever, like for a long time, and maybe even still to some extent, whatever, but you couldn't trade it at all outside the country, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It was just used like I think Hitler had one of those too, a Reichsmark or whatever. It was like one coin was worth 1 hour of labor. And that was it. But I doubt he was trading that. Actually, I heard that that's when they really decided to take him out. Was that they're like, really? Oh, wait, you can do whatever you want as long as you're not undermining the international monetary system.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, there's a lot of attention devoted to the international monetary system as far as the politicians are concerned, no matter how far you go back. So,
but in that, when you have a bunch of countries devaluing or abandoning any kind of standard, I would think, yes, you would. Everybody is looking for the kind of unipolar world order, or who's going to remain standing, where's the gold, and maybe that's what's not settled right now for us, and maybe I would even wonder if they generate that kind of an atmosphere on purpose. Like, I think that there's a chance that they're running us up such a high debt that can never be paid within this paradigm, so that they can give us the new dollar, which will be the digidollar or whatever. And so I just wonder sometimes about these crises, if they're being manufactured to make that transition rather than the other way around right now.
Yeah, well, there's certainly one embedded feature of a fractional reserve banking system and that feature is that it is literally impossible to pay off all of the debt, right? Because every time you make new money, that new money comes with a demand for interest. I make a loan for $5 million for 5 years, and it's 2.5 per. Oh no, I'm really bad at doing math in my head.
Okay, on the fly with no sleep. Don't worry about it.
Let's do it. Let's do $1 million. Let's do $1 million, 2.5% interest. So that's 25 so that's $25,000 for 5 years. So you get 25 times 5. What is that? 250K. Oh yeah, no, you're right. So anyway.
You can always do the tens. It's $1 million at 10%. It's $100,000.
It's $100,000. Okay. Let's just call it a 1-year loan. So it can be a 5-year loan. So you make a loan for $1 million, is 10%, like you said, and it's due in 5 years. And like it's super simple interest. It's not amortizing or anything like that. You've created a future demand. Somebody needs to somehow get more money than was originally available. Right. So they need $1 million plus the $50,000 in interest, or the $500,000 in interest. And when you think about the fact that each and every okay, back up. I assume I'm just assuming here that we're all familiar with the idea of fractional reserve banking, how money comes about through lending, the
I think so.
Kind of thing. Okay. If maybe in comments or emails or whatever, if your listeners want to do like a separate thing about that.
Well, do you have a YouTube video that addresses that level of basicness? I could put it
No,
in
but
the
I could
show
make
notes.
one.
We put in the show notes. But I think most people who listen know fractional reserve banking is basically the banks make this. Actually, the fraction is zero right now. So
Right, yeah.
banks are just enabled to create money out of thin air, and that definitely
as they
connects to it. No gold standard.
Yep.
You couldn't do that if money were money.
For sure, yeah. But that's an embedded feature of the money system we have, is that there's never enough money to pay off all of the debt. And on one hand, it's like, okay, but not all of the debt needs to be paid off at once. But on the other hand, what that means is that if that credit creation tap, or if that credit creation engine ever stops, then somebody is by definition going to default. Right, because with each additional unit of debt, every additional $1 million that you create, and it gets sent out there into the ether, that's somebody's obligation to pay. And there was not enough money to pay off that debt before it was issued. And so if the money supply stops expanding, then just mathematically on its own, that means that people are going to default. The money does not exist.
In a sound money environment, like say a gold standard environment, you'd never have a 10% interest rate probably, because nominal and real would be the same. And the way people would pay it back is they would produce something of value. And that valuable thing would free up some labor or tech to dig up more gold.
Yeah.
So you'd actually have more money. But short of that, since money is not real, our system, and not to mention that it is a debt-based currency, they actually rely on that to make more money. And then they say that that we need more money, that money itself is what makes the economy expand. And I get a little foggy at that point. Like, is the velocity of money really a driver for real value? You know what I mean? Is that true?
Right.
But I'm done now. Like, you've got everything. That's as far as I'm going to be able to really intuit what you're saying. And okay, so yes, it's meant to collapse if it does not ever expand.
Right, yeah. If the stock of debt stops expanding, then people default on debt.
This is what happened. I think this is how I understand what happened. So in 2008, they got to that point. It was going to collapse. You were going to have a debt collapse, and they can't have that, because that really reshuffles the hierarchy. So people go bankrupt who were, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Yep. So they had zero interest rates for a really long time, so that you could continue to refinance that debt or pay. Yes. I mean, if you have zero interest rates, you can actually pay a discount. You can incur as much debt as you want if you don't have to pay any interest. So they kept doing that, and I'll tell you, I was like, there were two things. I was like, A, how are they going to keep this 11-year expansion going when there's a 2% interest rate, and any recession needs, according to the Keynesian model, which is what they use, needs 5%. You have to go further down. Yeah, what are they going to do? What could they possibly do going into an election year to get negative interest rates? It's not possible. And I was like, they have to do something crazy. And then COVID happened. And I was absolutely convinced that the primary reason, at least for the timing and manner of that event, was what they did, which is they just hyper created money, hyper created. And you see the inflation. I mean, they just made money worth, I would say, half of what it was worth before. And that got us out of that 2008 bust, and it bought them credibility, which is disgusting. That makes me sick. But I think that's what happened. Because now
they get to raise rates to fight the inflation.
Oh, they saved it. Yeah. In their narrative, I don't even like that Reagan and Volcker saved the dollar.
No, yeah.
It had collapsed in 10 years. It was like, oh, this no gold standard thing is a disaster. And they were just like, wait, we can make it work. Let's just do something crazy.
Yeah.
like a 15% interest rate. So so I think that collapse that you were talking about did actually happen. And because they put ZIRP or whatever, zero interest rate in perpetuity, then when COVID came along, and now we are absolutely experiencing we are paying for that. We are literally paying double for everything. Our wages haven't adjusted. That's the thing about inflation, is that you're paying double before the wages adjust. People who own assets actually benefit.
That's the Cantillon effect. So the closer you are to the new money,
Yes.
then you benefit from the new money because you can take it before the price inflation hits and you can buy resources. But then by the time it gets to everybody else, it's not worth as much.
And also, I would say, and I've always learned about that, but the people who own the assets already, all they have to do is hang on, which is what they'd been doing for 14 years or whatever. So all they have to do is hang on. And then I always use the example of a gas station. Like when the price of oil goes up and your gas prices go up, the guy behind the register is still making $10 an hour.
Yep.
Like they'll run outside and make those prices higher and higher, but and the holder of assets is the one who gets that delta. Yeah. And that's why Keynes wanted sticky wages. Argued sticky wages were a problem, but sticky wages are fantastic. Sticky wages are great. You don't want to inflate people's productivity away without letting them know. That way they don't know. It's really messed up.
Yeah. And then it is good for wages to adjust if it really depends on what kind of regime you have on in controlling the steering wheel. Like in the Great Depression, it would have been really awesome if wages had been super, super flexible.
Yes. I don't disagree with that. But what I'm saying is he uses that term as if it's a bad thing and it justifies inflation. But what he's saying is you can't take 100% of productivity improvements to yourself because the wage earner will demand more.
Right.
And in that, but we want 100%. And I would ask you, as a student of history of stuff like this, my son did, I've mentioned this on the air numerous times, but my son did a second grade project and I was trying to explain to him the value of the gold standard. And maybe I got it wrong, maybe I got it right, but the teacher was blown away because what we looked at was the price of milk in 1800 and the price of milk in 1900 and the price of milk in 2000. And it was flat, if not down. And then now, it's like 10 times it is now. But wages were up slightly from 1800 to 1900. And from 1900 to 2000, wages are not up by as much as the price. Now, milk is probably a bad example because it's so manipulated. But I think that would prove how wages really, closer to how wages really behave.
Yeah, because people are paid their productivity. It's not perfect, right? The market economy is it's dirty, it's messy. Like there's never some mathematical equation that employers have to say, oh, well, this person's productivity is blah, 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 so they will be paid X dollars an hour. But if you look at trends over time, people do tend to get paid according to the value that they produce. And so if you're in a monetary system where prices are allowed to inflate after they inflate and they just don't inflate very much to begin with, then what ultimately happens is that people reap the benefit of that productivity through their wage. And there were also other ways that they did. So Murray Rothbard pointed out that the length of the work week fell and the length of the work day fell between like 1870 and 1900. And so not only are people making more in nominal terms, but they're paying lower prices because you had steady deflation between those 2 points. And you had a situation where people didn't have to work as much to be able to afford the same basket of goods. So when you put those 3 things together, it's like, yeah, you had real wage increases and you had price stability, which is great.
And I would argue that a really free labor market, a labor market with very few barriers to movement, absolutely ensures that people get what they're worth, and you don't have to be terrified of losing your job because there's so much fluidity in the market. Yes, it's really, as as much as I'm a little disappointed in libertarianism not helping at all through lockdown, I do still
Oh yeah.
love the. I mean, the economics are true.
Yeah, yeah. It's certainly I mean, when you have no power, what are you going to do? But on the other hand, maybe that's a cop out. I don't
Well, no,
know.
I don't even. It wasn't even like that. It was just that I just went as a espousing the ideology of libertarianism as I have for so long, and like to people who aren't already libertarians, it can be eye opening, and that's great. But what I hadn't realized was that we were way, way beyond the point of ideology making any difference. It's really at this point, like it's the Republican Democrat. It's such a total and utter distraction. I mean, utter.
Yeah,
Like it makes no difference whatsoever. As if we actually stopped paying attention to the red blue thing, they'd pull back the curtain. You know what
yeah,
I mean? Like they did with COVID. They were like, yeah. It's not really a Democratic Republic or whatever. Like
yeah.
we will violate
We
every
will get
right.
our
It's
way.
totally fine. Yes, we'll get our way.
Yeah.
If we'll do it, if we can do it just by lying, that's fine.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we'll do it with guns or whatever. So, okay.
Yep.
So why did the dollar take over from sterling?
Well, it's important to understand why sterling was attractive, and I think we talked about a couple of those points. But so there's a couple more. So the first that at least as far as I order them, and it's not necessarily of importance, but just intuitively how to understand it. Um, but the Bank of England, oh yeah, we already covered that. So the Bank of England maintained convertibility to gold than all the other countries in Europe, or at least most of them. So second, the powerhouse as far as the banking system was concerned in Europe, the powerhouse up to that point, at least up to the end of the 18th century, had been the Bank of Amsterdam. So the Bank of Amsterdam is widely considered to be, it was founded in 1609, is widely considered to be the first central bank. The really interesting thing about the Bank of Amsterdam is that for the first, let's see, over 100 years, so from 1609 to 1780, it basically did not expand the money supply. What it would do is and I'm kind of on a tangent here, but I think this will be interesting for anybody listening. What the Bank of Amsterdam did is they converted illiquid coins. Right. So most people have probably heard about, just in general, they know that the kings in Europe, the kingdoms, when they would go to war with each other or for whatever reason, they would debase their currency. So um, let's say our Florentian florin from the medieval ages had such and such content of gold. Maybe it was 3.5 grams or something. Well, by the 1700s, that was probably more like a gram or maybe a gram and a half. This happened all over Europe. The kingdoms would do things called sweating the money, which is where they would melt it down and then they would take the gold and silver content out of it and replace it with cheaper metals, or they would. Oh gosh, what's the word? They would grind it. So these metals are soft. And so if you just put them in a bag and shake it around, if you give it enough friction, the precious metal will actually come off in the form of a dust. And then you can harvest the dust, and then boom, the king has more money. So this had been happening throughout Europe for hundreds of years at this point. And the currency that people are transacting in is just this chaos, this amalgamation of all of the. You've got florins, you've got ducats, you've got pound sterling, you've got livre tournois from France. So you have all these currencies, and nobody is. It's a lot of work to keep track of the value of these things, and they don't trade well outside of the country in which they're issued. So the Bank of Amsterdam actually solved this problem by saying so they will quote rates of all of these different currencies, and then we will take your metal currency and we'll turn it into a bank deposit. Okay, so that way, and the bank deposit is in guilders. So the bank deposit is in a currency that does not actually have a form in coin. The Dutch guilder only existed on the ledger of the Bank of Amsterdam,
Oh,
and
it
then the
sounds
other
like it's made
banks.
of gold.
Yeah, except it's really made of paper. Like
Wow.
it only exists on paper. So they say, okay, we will take your florins from Florencia, Italy, and then we will turn it into a deposit of guilders, and that'll be on our book. You can then command that deposit. You can transfer it to one of our other customers, do whatever you want with it. You can move it to our correspondent in London if you want to. If you pay us a fee, you can get it, you can get it back out in coins. Most people didn't really want to do that. So the Bank of Amsterdam was literally a storage house for money, and they would take an illiquid form of money and turn it into a liquid form of money. And if you look at the Bank of Amsterdam's balance sheet from 1609, basically when they started, all the way up until 1780, they really didn't expand credit. They didn't take they didn't take this monetary base, this metal, and start writing credit to anybody who wanted it, right? They just took it and they turned it into deposits, and people would then transact with the deposits. And that was sort of the magic of the Bank of Amsterdam. Where they got into trouble was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. So they financed the Dutch East India Company, which was doing, I believe the East India Company was doing a lot of the fighting in the war, privateers and such. And they financed the Amsterdam government and whatever the government of the Netherlands looked like at that time to fight this war with England.
What
And
year is
so
this?
1697 or no 1780, excuse me, I'm way off. Yeah, 1780
1780. Okay.
Yeah, and that war ended in, I believe, 784, English victory. So the Bank of Amsterdam embarks in this journey of credit expansion where not only are they taking in, so they no longer have this ratio of one metal to one deposit, right? They expand that ratio to write this credit to the Dutch East India Company and the various governments in the Netherlands. And if they had won the war, they may not have gone under, right? But they lost the war. And so they did go under. By the early 1800s, the Bank of Amsterdam actually closed and it was replaced with a different central bank. And so that created a vacuum for Britain, which beat the Dutch to step in.
I wonder what were the terms of the peace. Like, I wonder if England has owned Amsterdam ever since, because the Dutch royal family is a little shady. Like, I don't know if they could be running the world right now, or they could just be a vassal of England. I wonder if that, it's those turning points in history where, behind the scenes, the occulted knowledge can last through the ages. So that's an interesting little pivot point. Maybe you need to look into whatever the war you were talking about earlier. Maybe I'll look into this one.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, actually. I would like to know. The people who, it was very easy when the Dutch East India Company did finally decide, okay, we really want to take some, we really want some credit from the Bank of Amsterdam. It was a very corrupt institution. I'm surprised it lasted as long as it did, only essentially doing deposit banking, because the owners of the Bank of Amsterdam also owned a great deal of the shit in the Dutch East India Company. So again, I'm very surprised that it went as long as it did under that system, because it would have been very simple for them to just say, okay, Dutch East India Company, you want us to create some deposits to buy some stocks or some bonds, or just write you a loan and whatever. But it was when they fought the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War that they went against those principles, and they got slammed for it. And so one reason that I bring that up is because in this de-dollarization conversation, we talk about central banks' balance sheets. How many of these big central banks have expanded their balance sheet? And when they expand their balance sheet, they're buying debt. So when we talk about the Fed expanding its balance sheet from $1 trillion in 2007, like 800 billion or something, all the way up to, I think it peaked at 8.5 trillion. 8.5 trillion, something like that, in 2022. That's balance sheet expansion, and they're doing that by buying all of this debt. It's very similar to what the Bank of Amsterdam did in 1780. And so this idea that the more a central bank expands its balance sheet, the more that central bank's currency kind of falls into question, falls into danger, the more the stability of that central bank gets called into question, is very real. Like, it's happened before. So that's not. So it's not crazy to say if a central bank expands its balance sheet too much, then yeah, it's going to have some problems.
Well, Russia did in the 90s.
Yes, yeah, they did, and the involvement of the Treasury Department and Goldman Sachs in making all that happen was, again, evil and evil genius.
Is that the one, the smartest guys in the room?
I thought that was about Enron, but I could be wrong.
Oh, it might be. There was one about long-term capital management, right? Wasn't that part of the Russian collapse?
Yes, yeah, they bought high yield Russian bonds, and the bonds went bad because Russia went bad.
But you think that Goldman Sachs and those guys had a part? It was called When Genius Failed. That's it. And actually, I have the Lords of Finance. I have that one. I probably have both of them. But so I wonder. So you're saying that outside entities were instrumental in the Russian collapse?
Yeah, so I read some articles from back in the early 90s. Yeah, so 1991, 1992. There was a lot of debate when the Soviet Union fell about how to disperse the assets, right? Because it seems very simple to go communism to free market capitalism, whatever. But what is the method by which you're going to take assets that have been in the arms of the state and you're going to make them available to the population? If you convolute it and do it in a very finicky way that no one understands but the people who are writing the plan, then you can arrange a situation where only your friend relatives are going to be able to acquire Russian assets. So they came up with this. So there was a writer in, I think, I don't know if it was in the Moscow Times, and this article had been translated into English, but they were specifically talking about the Moscow assets, and this was somebody who was sympathetic to like libertarian free market economics, and so she was arguing, and she posted many articles like this, but I should know the name, but it's been a long time since I've read up on this, but she was arguing that the way that this should be done is just an auction. You tell people what the assets are. Here is a building. Russia has a currency. People can take what they have. They bring it here, and you just auction it off as simple as possible. What was devised instead, and where I think the outside influence came in, is they devised this weird voucher system where basically every household in the Soviet Union, or at least the Russian part of the Soviet Union, would get an allotment of vouchers. But then it was designed in such a way where it was very easy to convince these Russian households to sell their vouchers for less than they were worth.
Exactly. I had a Russian friend. He said they were so used to like rubles being worth nothing or whatever. They didn't think it was going to be worth anything anyway. And they were absolutely bamboozled for sure. And that was the plan. Very good. I was wondering if I wasn't wondering if you got it. I was wondering if I understood it correctly from my actual friend who was a part of it, was a citizen. And what you're saying is exactly what he said. And he said that something that still happens there is they have really old dollars. They have they still save that's how they used to save. That's how they used to stockpile. Like they were under their mattresses. He thinks there's a lot of actual paper dollars from really, really old ones over there under mattresses and stuff. But
I wonder if there's some coins with silver content too.
Yeah. Oh yeah, maybe. But I do. Oh yes, maybe. But I think it's gratifying to hear that your stories align, because now I feel like that's probably exactly what happened.
Yeah. People just didn't know what those assets were worth. It's like the one anecdote I heard is that they could buy, 10,000 rubles or you pick the number for just a vodka, and it was but with those 10,000 rubles you could then go and buy a building in Moscow. So it was just insane.
Yeah, because people just didn't have faith in stock or whatever, shares. And I actually, when I look at last time I looked, which was probably 5 years ago, of what Russia's debt was, it was only 13% of GDP when like Germany was like 113%. And I thought, maybe going bankrupt once in a while, maybe having no credit is not a bad way to go.
Yeah, I think that one of the greatest things for the United States economy, when it was a fledgling developing basket spec, just after the revolution, was they actually allowed their continental currency to fail. And that is literally what Ludwig von Mises, and I think it's the theory of money and credit, but I could be wrong. The right thing to do when your currency comes under pressure um, is not to do what Volcker and Carter did, or Volcker and
And
Reagan, and try to
Reagan,
raise the rate.
I know.
You
That's
just
funny
let
because
it.
I
If
hate
the
that.
currency is going to fall, you just let it collapse.
Yes, that's what I thought. That's funny. I never
Yeah.
heard, I don't remember reading that. Although Pete Q would say, if it's out there, you read it, and that's why you think it. Like, there's basically no original thought. If it's already out there, you cannot take credit
Agreed.
for having it. You agree?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, because he says that the New York Times crossword puzzle is easier to do at night.
Really?
So all the people who do it in the morning are using those words all day.
Oh yeah.
And then you think you've got it, but
That's so interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Even if it's not true, like, it's still true.
Yeah.
It has to be true. And even in a micron amount of movement, it has to be true.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
so
If you hear those words, even if there's even a 2% greater likelihood of you hearing those words, then it's going to increase your chances of doing the yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, totally.
That's interesting. I've never heard that.
Yeah, I love it. I
part of
love
that
it. Even if
reasoning
it's
before.
just total bullshit, it's definitely true. So,
Cool.
yes. So, okay. So they have, so collapse isn't always as bad as it sounds.
I'm sorry.
I said collapse is not always as bad as it sounds. So I don't know where we're definitely sneaking around here. So where are we going to come back and pick up that original mainstream?
Okay, so in London, the London money market comes into a position where it's basically financing all of global trade. So if a wine seller, like let's say a wine retailer in the United States, wants to buy a shipment of wine from somebody in Paris, let's say, a wine wholesaling firm, however you want to call it. Obviously, these business arrangements probably have very different names back then. But let's say this U.S. firm that wants to import like $1,000 worth of wine, and then it wants to sell it. They're not going to do this they're not going to do this in dollars, and they're not going to do it in francs either. And they're not even going to really settle it between banks, just between France and the US. So what's actually going to happen is the bank of the US importer is going to have a correspondent in London, and the bank of the Parisian, or the French exporter, is going to have a correspondent in London. And ultimately, that's where that trade is going to settle. It's going to happen in the London money market rather than New York or Paris. And the reason that they do that is because there ends up being a very active and what's called liquid money market in the city of London. So it's very easy for these banks to take all of this credit, being this very short-term credit. When we talk about credit, when it comes to trade, we're talking 30, 60, 90 days. It's not, this sort of 5-year loan or a 30-year mortgage or anything like that. Super short term. But the London money market gets really good at handling all of this trade activity from around the world. And so it's a very attractive place to park some cash. Like, let's say that you're a wealthy citizen, or you're a firm with a lot of excess in France, and you just want a stable place to invest and earn some interest. Through your correspondent in Paris, or excuse me, through your bank in Paris, they will make arrangements with their correspondent in London. Your balances will essentially be forwarded, converted into sterling, and you'll be earning a sterling interest rate. So they really smoothed out these sorts of arrangements in such a way that it just became a very attractive place to park. It became a savings account for the world, and it also became a source of, exactly, really a clearinghouse, and a source of import-export credit for the world. And so while the Bank of Amsterdam was, the first central bank as most people know it, the Bank of Amsterdam wasn't playing as big of a role as the Bank of England was. And the Amsterdam Financial Center wasn't playing as big of a role as the City of London was. So these are things that really got going specifically in the mid 19th century. That's when you really had like all the components of a truly reserve currency that we see today. The sterling, at least the way that I see it, I've read because there's a lot of people will say, at some point the French franc was the reserve currency and the Dutch guilder, and then before that it was like the Spanish silver dollar. And the way that I see it, there's a little bit of truth to that, in that there was some international use of those currencies. And Amsterdam did truly innovate in how they took those metals and they turned them into deposits that people found it very easy to use, and a lot of people did use. A lot of traders, firms, other banks. But the first currency to really play all of the
Hold on.
roles.
That is very interesting, but I did think that the Knights Templar during the Crusades were really the first ones to use paper to represent, like on a widespread scale, to represent metal in a bank. But what Amsterdam did was a little different because it was about the problem of competing currencies.
Yeah, I would say yes. So in the London money market, what would happen is that you had this trade activity. People are not paying in paper currency. They're paying in these things called bills of exchange. Those bills of exchange originated in the era that you're talking about, which is the Templar era, basically the Middle Ages. And so you have the Templars who would use these things, and they would use them in order to be able to pay for things outside of the city where they would start their expedition. So I keep using Florence as an example, so let's just say Florence again. But now I'm down in the Mediterranean somewhere, and so I need to get some coin out of a storehouse in order to buy some stuff for my expedition. Okay. I'm not going to lug all of that coin with me, if I'm of the Knights Templar, if I'm on this campaign, if I'm on this military campaign. So what the bankers do back in my home city, let's say it's Florence, is they write me a bill that says that I'm entitled to 400 ducats or 400 florin or whatever the currency is in one of those different cities where that banking family has a correspondent. And the thing about and I'm glad you brought that up, because I did a little bit of actually a lot of research on medieval banking just a few days ago, and there's a book on it,
as one does.
Yeah, there's actually a book on it by an economist named Raymond de Roover, who is basically like the economic historian on medieval banking. So he's got, he really dove into it, and I was just reading one of his papers, and it's amazing. But the way that banking would work back then is they would use these bills in order to say, hey, I am a customer of such and such banker back in Florence. Let's say it could be the Medicis, right? I'm a customer of the Medicis back in Florence. I am now here in, let's say
Mecca. So, they didn't go to Mecca. They went to Jerusalem. Yeah. They went to Jerusalem.
Okay. Yeah. So let's say I'm at Jerusalem, or maybe I'm in Turkey or somewhere on the way, and I now need some coins from a correspondent of Medici. I have this piece of paper. It has Medici's seal on it, and it entitles me to 400 florin of coins, so that I can go and buy some food and weapons, or whatever. So that is where this idea of correspondent banking and how using paper to command coins is definitely where this originated, at least in Europe, because with, like most things, the Chinese were doing it however many centuries ago.
Yes. But the Amsterdam innovation was different. I understand it. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and then and it's funny because you're Catholic, right? So the reason that the Medicis and the Templars came up with this bill of exchange thing is because it was a way of making a loan without making a loan. So the Catholic Church at the time had strict laws against
usury, not loans, but usury.
Usury, the collecting of interest off of
you could make a loan, you just couldn't profit from it.
Right. So with a bill of exchange, they would arrange it in such a way, and it really was this way. Whatever city your customer is going to, they're getting this bill of exchange because they need to buy something in another city. Whatever city this customer of yours is going to have a different currency than your own. This is an era of city-states in a lot of Europe, and people are going between, present day France and present day Germany and present day Italy and all the way up to London. And so the way that they do this is they call it a bill of exchange because we're not making a loan, we are exchanging currencies. We're exchanging florins for pounds sterling between Florencia and London. Right? We're not making a loan of florins to be paid back in florins with interest. What we're doing is we're advancing florins to exchange for pounds in another city.
And I agree with you that in the spirit of the rule against usury, that does not violate it. And there should be fees for services such as that. And I also think that when you get down to like financial investing, I think the idea of usury is a little bit different. I'm not defending interests or used whatever. I think the church went wrong in abandoning that, but I
actually think interest is good, but carry on.
Yeah, so I think that if somebody needs a loan for something, you can't take advantage of their poverty or their need. But if you are trying to speculate on something, then yes, of course, you should be compensated for the time value of money, for the risk, like all of those things I don't think violate any kind of moral law. And of course, it motivates people so I have a sister who she's like the bank of our family. So everybody, when everybody needs any money, I've asked her money many times. I always pay her back, whatever. And she charged whatever, 3% interest, 5% interest. Then she stopped charging interest because she got it in her head that it was bad. And I'll never borrow money from her again. It was almost like an evil plot. Like because I don't want to take her money. I wanted it, I was like, I would give her more than the bank. I was like, hey, give me the money. I'll give you 5%. Exactly. It was great. It was a great system. However, if I were on my ass and she's like, I'll give you the money for 25%, yes, she's going to hell. But yeah, so I think that I don't know the moral law on usury, but I do believe that there are nuances. Of course, my friend, the priest who listens, I'm gonna get an email. He's gonna tell me like the whole story or whatever. Actually, he'll say it was good that you pointed that out, but this is a nuance that you missed and whatever. But yes, I will probably have to get a little educated on that. But yes, I think there's a good thing and then there's the exploitation.
If that does happen, just please copy me on the conversation because I would just love to read what he has to say.
I can tell by your previous life that you probably have Catholic roots yourself because you were an Irish dancer. A professional Irish dancer makes me think you're Irish.
Yeah, close.
You're not Irish? I never heard of an Irish dancer who wasn't Irish.
Oh, well, so Purcell is an Irish name. It originated in Tipperary, and it originated in Tipperary for sure. The problem with my genealogy is that I went, and maybe it was a vanity project, I don't know, but I'd go and do the ancestry thing. And the issue is that while they came from Ireland, that was like back in the 1680s. So I'm just kind of American, I could say
you're like a practically Mayflower. So why would you do Irish dancing? Because it's cool.
Why did I? Because
I love it. I did it when I was a kid, but I'm a little Brown to be taken seriously in that crowd of Maureen's, you know? And I'm like, no, my mother's name was Malarkey. But yeah, and I wasn't super.
It's a lot more diverse now.
It's so fun, though. It's super, super fun. And I caught your short on your YouTube channel. I just absolutely love something about Irish dancing. I absolutely love. I would love to be able to do it. It feels like such a fun thing to do. But I would have thought that you had some kind of Catholic connection. But you would be interested in my priest explanation because you cannot see what I just said about that distinction, or you want to know the actual real facts. Like, are you skeptical, or you just want to be educated?
No, I just want to, just for educational purposes.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, because all I know about what we just talked about is how so Raymond Rover, he used the writings of San Bernardino, who was alive in like 1380 to 1460, something like that. So he's there in the Medici banking era, and then he used another one called Sante d'Antonio, who was writing at about the same time. And his take on it, because I don't read Latin, so I'm probably never going to go and read directly Bernardino and Antonio had to say. But his take on it is that essentially the financial players of the day, the financial families it was this game of cat and mouse where they would come up with ways of financing, and then they would run it by the priests. And there were favorable priests who would put a rubber stamp on it and say, yes, this doesn't violate the law of usury. And then there were other ones who were a little more strict who would say, no, this bill of exchange thing you're doing is definitely interest.
You know, I might actually be wrong. It might be that financial capitalism technically is against Catholic social teaching. Absentee ownership. It is possible. It is possible. Now I'm going to have people go nuts because I was absolutely raised. My father, my uncle was a priest, and he turned me on to Murray Rothbard. So, like, for me to even think for 1 second that what I just said could be true is like makes my stomach turn. However,
yeah, that's a crisis internally.
Yes, it is possible that absentee ownership is frowned upon. And that's, the root of financial capitalism and all that. It is possible. Boy, I guess I do need some schooling. So, Father R, bring it.
Yeah, bring it.
So, yeah, keep going.
Okay, so why does sterling go away? So sterling is serving this world reserve currency purpose, and it does so from, call it the mid 19th century all the way up until most people think 1944. So there's a quote about this that I want to read off from an economist named Perry Mehrling, who is a super expert on money and banking, and he's not a libertarian or even dissident type of thinker in the slightest. He's a very mainstream guy, but his take on this, and he just said it in an interview one time, is he goes, so most people think that the global monetary system was created in mind of Zeus in a little hotel in New Hampshire in 1944, and that is just a myth. So 1944 being the year of the Bretton Woods Conference at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, and so and it it's expected that people would understand it this way because the way that history is taught is like, okay, it's never really taught in terms of economic relationships. It's always taught in terms of hierarchies. It's always taught in terms of this is who was at the top, and they made this rules, and this is what happened.
And after. It's who's at the top, like titularly, like the monarch, the king. Right. It's in the books, but who's really at the top, we don't know.
Like Abe Lincoln, you hear about Abe Lincoln, you don't hear about Salmon P. Chase and how Salmon P. Chase and his mate Jay Cook, who lost his ass in the Panic of 1873 and was America's biggest investment banker for, a period of several years, was actually responsible for designing the monetary system that proceeded for 50 years after the Civil War. Like, you don't hear about that shit. No. If you read Murray Rothbard, you will, because that was Murray Roth's game. He was like, and this was a really good friend of this guy, and so they came up with this policy in order to sell them,
Oh, I like that. That's what Adam from Deborah Gets Red Pilled calls parapolitics or metapolitics, but it's when you
Yeah.
connect those dots behind the scene. That's a good one.
Yeah. It's just the simple idea that it's kind of important to know who's making the rules. At least some.
Yes.
There may be more information embedded in who's making the rules than what the rules actually are.
Yeah. That's actually a very important point that you just made, because what the rules actually are, it's very hard to penetrate what the intended
Right.
consequences really are. But if
Yeah.
you know who it is, you know what they're after, and then
Yeah.
you can reverse engineer. Well, I can see how that could happen. Interesting.
Exactly.
And that's why we
Yeah.
are not you, but I don't know what you are, but that's what that's what the conspiracy theory approach to history is that, well, if you know who's behind it, then you understand that those consequences were intended.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people of main thought would call me a conspiracy theorist. So,
Okay. Well, I hate to slur you like that in the real
No,
world.
no,
I know you're in
that's
the
all right.
real world. Okay, keep going.
Let's see. Okay, so yes, the dollar pound parity, right? So just to give you some frame of reference here, the dollar pound parity in terms which came about as a result of the gold ratios, the pound sterling to gold and the dollar to gold, is about 486. So it takes throughout the 19th century, if the dollar and the pound trading at parity, which means neither of them would be devalued or have a premium to their gold value, then it would take $4.86 to buy 1 pound sterling. So, and that was the exchange rate
For
leading
so
up
long.
until about, yes, for a very long time.
I used to watch old movies in my sister's room, and
Yep.
she
It would have
always
been
would
in the old
say
movies.
how, they would say like a pound. I'm like, how much is that? She's like, that's $5.
Yep.
She always said that. But yeah, maybe it was the black and whites. I don't remember black and whites.
Yeah, the black and whites definitely would have had it because that exchange rate was. Oh man, I wish I remembered the very first time that they devalued. I want to say it was after World
Bretton
War
Woods?
II, but I could be wrong.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so essentially, one of the main points that I would really like to drive home is that the dollar began taking the mantle away from sterling long before this agreement in 1944. The other thing about the agreement in 1944 that people need to understand is that nobody wrote in the Bretton Woods Agreement that people now had to start transacting their international trade in dollars. Right, like that's not part of the agreement. As far as the currency that people choose to hold their savings in, and the currency that again, thinking about the U.S. importer and the French exporter, there's no iron law within Bretton Woods that says they have to transact in dollars. When somebody in Brazil buys something from Russia, there's no iron law that says that they have to transact. Like, that's not a part of Bretton Woods. It is literally the international money market that decided that that was how it was going to be, and it happened gradually over a period of a couple decades. So what happened in World War I is that essentially this was the first boost to the United States. I don't want to say the United States economy, because everybody pays an opportunity cost in war. And there's another economic myth that's very common out there, which is like, oh, we had a war and the economy boomed.
Yeah, the
And
broken window.
It's the broken window fallacy, exactly.
Yeah.
What could you have had if you didn't spend all that money and resources on
Even
war?
when I just look around and think about subsidized interest rates or even use of shoddy materials, I think there have been 123 billion people on Earth. And if you drive around England, I don't know if you've spent much time in England, everything's made of brick. They had bricks, and you see the corners. So I have a friend who lives in a house that was built in the 1600s, and it's not like worth more. It's just, why we tear houses down and build them up again. It's like
Walkers.
It's that thing. It's that fallacy. I mean, it works because transactions is where people make money. That's like another problem with the kind of financial capitalism thing, is that transactions have a lot of value to these people. So, but think of the amount of even like spiritual and intellectual progress we could make if we were freed up from just every single lifetime starting over from scratch to build the
Right.
house and make the clothes. I mean, it's really a tragedy.
Yep. You got to rebuild London because it's been bombed out all through World War
Yes,
II. You got to
yes.
rebuild Richmond because, William T. Sherman completely destroyed it, civilians
And we
included.
do it
Anyway,
ourselves
that's a,
now. That's
yeah.
why I hate interest rate manipulation. I even hate the interstate highway system. I don't like wars for oil. I don't like any
Yep.
of these things that subsidize transactions, because then uh you would correctly value those trade-offs. And I
And you
think
would
you
value space. You would value space and the time that it takes to travel. If a
yes.
firm had to create their own infrastructure
Yeah.
in order to get to wherever that office or wherever that storefront was located, they would co-locate a lot more.
Or we would have had, I said long before the Zoom age, there would be telecommuting. Like you would have
Mhm.
that for better or worse, but it would have been organic and we would have had
Right.
some control over it. And then you'd probably have houses with greenways, neighborhoods without roads. Like there's so many possibilities of how to make it good. But you relinquish control and they have they take these things that are good or bad and they plug it into that central vision they have. I don't know if you've heard
Mhm.
about 15-minute cities and stuff like that. It's
Oh
like a
yeah, for sure.
story for
Yeah.
another. Yeah, I did a lot of shows on
Yeah.
that. But yeah, I mean, it does matter that they, how they control the infrastructure, whether it's like physical or financial.
Yeah, what is the interstate highway? New Deal liberals or progressives or whatever you want to call them. They're all like, oh, and then FDR had the interstate highway system, or
Yes.
no, it's post
Eisenhower.
World War II, right? Eisenhower, the Republican all the Democrats love, or the Republican all the progressives love. We had the interstate highway system, and that made the economy boom. And it's like, you know what else the interstate highway? First of all, it didn't make the economy boom. Okay, a road is very simple, and we've had roads for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. Okay, there's nothing magical about a road that makes your economy boom. But I'm pretty sure I've heard you say these exact words on the show. But the interstate highway system subsidizes automobile travel.
And Chinese imports. Imports from
Right?
other places. There's no
Yeah,
there's
that
no
have to be
factory big
trucked.
enough that only one in the whole world can exist. There's no product that would justify a factory in China and not a factory in North America. And it
Yeah.
totally eliminates these transaction costs. I agree. And his argument, I'm telling you, I learned about that like in 5th grade, and I was like, that makes no sense. It's like it's good for
Mhm.
defense so we can get stuff around. I'm like, it's an open door for invaders. Like that goes both
Yeah.
ways. Like unless you are
Mhm.
ready and willing that you've actually detonated every single solitary mile of highway, that highway goes both ways.
Yeah, I actually didn't think about that.
I mean,
That's
I could be
interesting.
wrong,
Yeah.
but it seems to me
No, no, no. I
that,
mean,
if you live in the
yeah.
heartland, I don't know if you want like all roads lead to Iowa.
No, no, definitely not. I
You
don't.
know what I
Yeah.
mean? Have all the munitions along, like, 30 miles inland all the way around. Like, have all that stuff right by the coast and protect the mainland,
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
interior, the farmland. Don't, whatever. Okay.
Yeah, well, and that is something that retreating armies have often done is they will destroy their own transportation routes once they've used them, whether it's a railroad or a
Yes.
road.
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
pretty sure the
major
Germans did that
vulnerability.
as
Yes, the
as
Russians.
they were getting out of
Scorched earth.
France.
Yes,
Yep.
definitely. It's a vulnerability. There would have been a better way. It's obvious that wasn't his purpose, you know?
Yep.
So, mhm.
Oh, it could be so much better than it is.
That's,
Anyways.
you know what? Are you making fun? Because that is like, just lament, lament, lament. I'm not lamenting. Sometimes I like to envision what it is. Like we have to resign ourselves. I don't think there's I don't know the path of liberty in this place and time right now. Like
Right.
I can't see it. I've lost the thread there. But I think it is nice sometimes to visualize, okay, what might have been, but that helps also to understand what could be. So it's not
Right.
just a black pill, like lamenting, complaining. It's also, visionary in a way.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and there's certainly a case to be made for that in private digital money even though I think a lot of the private digital monies out there are actually created by the IA in order to in, in order to take legitimacy away from good private money. But that's probably a conversation for a different day. But
Okay.
anyway,
Yes,
my point.
definitely. I'm going to write that on. That'll be volume 3.
Okay, sounds good. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of potential out there for innovations, carve outs, opportunities for people to separate from these crappy systems that the state creates. And you don't have to have, a libertarian president in order to do things like that. I think there's a lot of local things people can do, a lot of entrepreneurial things people can do. So yeah, I definitely I try my best to approach it from a place of hope rather than blackpilling, like you said, for
Yeah.
sure.
I mean, and these people who obviously have a disproportionate influence about over where the world is going, I actually do not think that their goal is to destroy humanity and the earth. Like, it might be,
No, they need it
but
because
yeah,
that's what
I
makes
don't
the profit.
yeah, they don't really believe. I don't really think they believe that they're ascending to another planet or
Right.
entering into the afterlife. I mean, they want cool places to go and they want to do stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like it's not as draconian as all that, but it would be nice if we weren't the whatever, just considered subhuman because we don't pull the strings. But anyway, okay, so
Yeah.
where are we in our narrative?
Yeah, so we're at basically between World War One and World War Two. So so this era here is where the United States dollar starts to take over these roles that sterling is playing. It's like you said, a clearinghouse for international trade, and people around the world, be it firms, banks, and to a certain extent governments. There were several governments, believe, after World War One that decided to start pegging their currencies to the dollar. Now, you did have other governments, especially in Europe. In the Great Depression, you had what was called the Swing Bloc, which was made up of countries that went completely off of the gold standard. And so instead of gold, they pegged the value of their currency to the pound sterling. And so that was definitely a thing. But I believe by the 1920s, and I'll go back and double check that, but I believe the first few countries to start pegging to the dollar came about in the 1920s. And it was common in South America. So over here on our side of the pond, a lot of this foreign trade business between South America and its trading partners in these different countries was being done in dollars rather than sterling. And the way that we know that is actually, again, another super mainstream source who wrote Exorbitant Privilege and another book about the dollar system. But his name is Barry Eichengreen. He used to be a Federal Reserve Board governor, I think. So super mainstream. But what he did was go back and look at, okay, if trade is being financed in dollars, trade is being done using these money market instruments that we talked about earlier, these bills of exchange, which is essentially a promise to pay some currency in 30, 60, 90 days or so. And those, like we talked about, they originated all the way back in the Middle Ages. Now, if the dollar is starting to take over as the reserve currency, then when we look at the balance sheets of major London banks or major banks around the world, then we should start to see a lot of those bills being denominated in dollars, which is to say the promise to pay is in dollars ultimately rather than sterling. We should start to see that in
Oh,
this time.
interesting.
And so that's the evidence that he uses to kind of show, okay, as you go through the 1920s and the 1930s, you start to see more of these bills stack up in the city of London. And the interesting thing is that this activity is being done in London, but it's happening in dollars instead of sterling.
And so it's the demand that's driving the supply. And then what do they do about the supply? They have to meet the supply.
Yes.
But fractional reserve banking allows that. So what year are we talking about here?
So this is the 1920s up through the Great Depression. And now international trade kind of broke down in the Great Depression. So that is
But we had fractional reserve banking by then, right? That was post-Fed.
We had fractional reserve banking even under a gold standard.
Fed?
Yeah,
Before
yeah,
the
yeah.
Fed.
So even on the gold standard,
But this is still a gold
banks were.
standard a little bit, right?
Oh yes, yeah. So in the era we're talking about, we have a Fed and we have a gold
Right.
standard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's what we're
Okay.
talking
So,
about
but I
during
think
the.
I was just trying to understand that. So it sounds like the obligation to pay in dollars preceded the actual dollar being created to, or is that not correct?
I actually so the source is, if going back to the sterling system, what ultimately made financing trade in that particular currency possible was the desire for participants in the economy all over the world to hold that currency. So my view of it is that the desire to save in dollars ultimately leads to this international trade activity being done in dollars,
Okay.
because what
Okay.
happens is you have
I understand.
dollar deposits that find their way into these banks. That's a
Right.
source of funding for the banks, and so they're going to use dollars in order to write these bills of exchange.
Okay. Okay.
So that's that one is, as far as which came first, the chicken or the egg. Again,
Yeah.
I truly think, in the time that I've spent studying this change between the British pound sterling and the dollar as the global currency standard, I really do think that it is ultimately the desire to hold that currency that
Mm-hmm.
precedes
Okay.
all of the credit, all of the
Right. Okay.
international trade settlement. Um, there may, I haven't seen an opinion that was totally different from that. And, there may be, but that's kind of my
Okay.
view.
I accept that.
Yeah, from what I can tell. So yeah, so you have that, and then so not only do you have all of this bills of exchange activity that's indicating that international trade is being done in dollars, but by the late 1920s, you actually have some years in which foreign central banks are holding more dollars than they are pound sterling. So they basically switch off between World War One and World War Two. There are a handful of years where where the U.S. dollar makes up a greater share of FX reserves than the pound sterling. Most of the reserves are in gold, right? Because we were on a gold standard at that point, and the central banks did make a point to hold. You know, they did make a point to maintain gold. Um, the portion of it that was made up of foreign currencies, paper foreign currencies, you had some years where you would have more dollars in those FX reserves than sterling, and then you had other years where you would have more sterling than dollars. And then so there's this, so you really have this 20-year period where the dollar is slowly creeping up on the sterling's role. Um, Not everybody in the world is certain that the sterling is going to go away. In fact, most people probably don't think that the sterling is going to go away. Most people think that eventually the world is going to go back to a sterling system ultimately. But as we know, that's not how it happened. And so there's this, like I said, there's some years where sterling is dominant. There's other years where the dollar is dominant, and then who ends up on top? That ultimately comes down to World War II. So again, the United States gets to capitalize on this fact as just dumb luck. We have two oceans that separate us from the rest of the world. We're a lot harder to invade. We're a lot harder to attack. So that benefited us in World War One, right? So we got to supply Europe with all the weapons that it wanted. As far as I know, we didn't sell to the Germans and the Central Powers, but we may have, behind some back door. I don't know. Who knows? But the United States got to benefit from the fact that we were the benefactors of Europe losing all of its gold, or losing a significant amount of its gold to pay for all of these goods, because we were the ones supplying those goods in the war effort. And then in World War II, we had a lot more of a role militarily. We were in the war for longer. I don't know. Um, I don't know how many folks will already know this, but World War One, the U.S. came in at the tail end. We were only there
Yeah,
for, I
one
think it was
year.
less than a year. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, so I think my great great uncle was in World War One, I believe. Yeah, he got shipped over there. I think he was drafted, and he definitely came back with shell shock,
What a
because
ridiculous
he.
war that was. for
Yeah.
us. I mean, there were more Germans as American citizens than English. They were literally deciding which side of the war to go in on. Ugh.
Yeah.
I have a book here
Yeah.
that someone just texted me about. Did you ever read this? And I read it twice. The Hidden History of World War I.
I'll have to write that one down.
Oh, yes. It's I actually can look at the text from today because he writes it. I think it's Doherty. And my friend James sent that to me. Doherty, Jerry Doherty. And I think there's another author. I forget the name. Doherty. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I would love to read that.
It's nicely written too. Like, it's fun to read. It's easy to read.
And I think understanding how the dollar got its role in the first place is, like, once you have that foundational knowledge, it's really easy to look at a headline about, oh, the Brazilians and the Argentinians are going to come up with a clearing currency union between the two so that they don't have to use dollars. And like, I look at a headline like that and I just laugh
because it doesn't you don't just snap your fingers and there it goes.
Yeah.
Context is really important, and you do have to have a deeper understanding. Sometimes I kind of slap myself on the wrist for just drive-by assessing things. And I think once in a while, I'm like, you know what? This is way more complicated than just... You can laugh at that headline, but for me to laugh at that headline would be arrogant because I really actually don't know for sure that you can't just snap your fingers and make those things happen. But I think I'll have a better sense of it now, and then I'll better understand what you're saying about why that isn't happening, because that is part of the next chapter of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and with special attention to this idea of a BRICS clearing currency that, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America or South Africa, are going to get together and supplant the dollar because they want to.
You know why I'm suspicious of that? Because that expression BRICS was introduced, you probably know, in like an academic paper from the West of someone, if I recall correctly, like observing it.
Yeah, I think it was an investment banker.
Oh, you think it was an investment banker? I felt like that was an academic who coined that term.
I'll have to go back. I'll have to go back and look.
But my thing
Jim
is,
Rickards mentions it in this book.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just see who did it, because Jim O'Neill, an acronym started in 2001. Jim O'Neill, Goldman Sachs economist for Brazil. Later, South Africa's added to become. So I was wrong about that, but you were right. Well, he's an economist, not an investment banker. But
yeah, I was wrong too.
Not really. Less wrong than I was. But no, my point is that when you see something like that get a lot of air right away, just really take off right away, even though it seems like it's equally likely that 100 other things would happen. And then even like 10 years later, when it kind of felt like it was stalling, I was like, are people still saying BRICS, blah, blah, blah. And then, still. And now again, it's still in the news. And that, to me, it feels like that was a little insider knowledge, that this is something that was going to be supported. It wasn't just an idea or an observation. It was really a plan. And whether it comes to fruition, or is it just used as a foil, I don't know. But, it feels artificial to me, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not organic. And the way that sterling took over the world was not on purpose. The people at the Bank of England never said, oh, hey, we want to be responsible for clearing all of the world's trade in our banking system. They never set out to do that, but it's just what happened. And even the Federal Reserve never really wanted that responsibility either. There's a lot of discussion basically between World War II and like the 70s of kind of how much of a pain in the ass it is to be a reserve currency, because whenever things go bad in somebody else's monetary system, everybody goes to your central bank and says, please give me some dollars, otherwise my economy is going to collapse.
Did you ever hear that like Montague and those guys cooked up the Fed as a backstop for the European central banks because they didn't have the flexibility to do it?
Well, yeah, I think that's what Murray Rothbard kind of gets at in his History of Money and Banking.
Do you think that's true?
Yeah, because Montague, so I think that the reason that they wanted a central bank in the U.S. is because they were tired of what happened in the U.S. ending up on the Bank of England's doorstep. I certainly think that was part of it, but also because it would just be easier with central bank coordination. It would be easier to have a cooperative government in the United States. I think, because the people who organized the Federal Reserve System and the people who were managing the Bank of England at the time were all very well intertwined. We're talking about J.P. Morgan, Warburg. I don't think
Right.
I
It was
forgot
an
when
international
exactly Montague
endeavor.
Norman was. Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it was, the Bank of England bankers definitely wanted the U.S. to have a central bank for a very long
Yeah.
time. There's
Yeah.
no disputing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was so that the U.S. could basically organize its own bailouts, kind of thing, um, so that the Fed could bail out the banks rather than the Bank of England having to send gold to the U.S. And there's another motivation there, like like we were talking about in the '70s earlier, the desire to maintain gold and not have to ship it anywhere. That's something that's a thread that runs through government,
Mm.
like monetary policymakers and the Treasury departments, and in individual banks. There's a desire to only have to ship gold when you absolutely have to, and minimize how many times you run into that situation. Absolutely, like they just don't want to. They don't want to move gold. They really would prefer to do everything on a ledger. I think that's the case for all bankers
You're right.
throughout
Right.
history. Um, so we get up to the end of World War II. The U.S. has again supplied the European war effort to a great deal. Most of Europe is, especially France and Britain, are in a huge deal of debt to the United States. And the United States doesn't write off France and England's debt, and it's really funny because they don't have much of a say in how much reparations are going to be owed by the Germans. How the reparations debt for the Germans was just huge, and how that basically ended in hyperinflation and crashed the German economy and probably led to the rise of Hitler and all those things. Um, the United States didn't have much say, and didn't care to have much say in what the debt burden of Germany was going to be. But they did look at Britain and France and say, "We understand that you have your problems. We still would like our money back, please." And so when you put those two things together, where are Britain and Germany going to, or where are Britain and France going to get that money? They actually end up getting it from Britain. Or excuse me, not Britain. I'm getting all these countries mixed up. They actually end up getting those dollars in the form of reparations payments from Germany. So rather than demanding gold marks, they'll demand dollars, and then they'll use the dollars to pay off their own debt to the United States. And so behind that reparations ordeal between Germany, France, and Britain is the United States, who's saying, "Hey, France, hey, Britain, yes, we have all of your gold now, but we still sold you all of these bonds, and we would like to be paid back." And so that's what happened between
Hmm.
World War One and World War Two. At the end of World War Two, the Allies are once again in debt to the United States. The Fed has printed a huge ton of money in order to pay for the war. They were much more involved in paying for World War II than they were in World War One. But the interesting thing about the United States this time is they accumulated a lot more gold throughout the war than they did in World War One. So the U.S. ends up having 2/3 of the monetary gold stock of the world at the end of the war.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when you think about it this way, it's like, did Bretton Woods really decide that the dollar was the reserve currency, or did the
To
dollar
the
become
fact
reserve
that they had
currency
all the
because
gold.
they had all the gold? They
They
literally
were the
had the
reserve
reserve.
currency, whether
Right.
you don't have to even call it that.
Exactly. So yeah. So that's where we're at the end of World War II. And when you think about it that way, it's like, okay, it's pretty logical. If I'm an international banker, an international investor, the U.S. looks like a very safe to be. The U.S. dollar looks like a safe place to be. It is still ultimately convertible to gold, even though I can't do it. So the thing about the gold standard after World War II is that individuals in the United States cannot take dollars to the Treasury and say, I would like gold, please. That all ended in 1933 when FDR confiscated everybody's gold on, I think it was May 1st. And then they confiscated it for $20 an ounce, 2067.
Is that when he repealed prohibition? Little distraction there.
Shit, I don't know.
I think maybe.
Yeah, maybe so. Actually, I don't know. Actually,
I think it might be.
Yeah. So they bought gold from the American people for 2067 an ounce, and then less than a year later, in 1934, they turn around and start selling gold to the rest of the Treasury. Turns around and starts selling gold to the rest of the world for $35 an ounce. So put over a barrel, people were. But yeah, so the dollar price of gold from 1790, the founding, all the way up until 1934 was 2067, bar a couple periods of non-convertibility there. Abraham Lincoln took the U.S. off the gold standard, like we talked about, but it was 2067 an ounce for over 100 years. And then it gets devalued to $35 an ounce in 1934. And that is the gold price that is the gold price that persists into the era after World War II, $35 an ounce, all the way up until 1971.
So time out.
Yeah.
Was there inflation during that time? Was gold getting cheaper, but you just couldn't buy it? So it's like a ruble in the USSR. Like, it doesn't matter what you call the price.
Well, for dollar holders,
pay it.
For dollar holders, gold got more expensive, but they couldn't. Not like they could get it.
But I'm just saying, for the years that it was $30 or $35, that was decades, right? Decades.
Yeah, it was from 1934 to 1971, so almost 40 years.
Okay, it's like 40 years. So during that time, if there was any inflation whatsoever, gold was getting cheaper to dollar holders, because you would have, if your wages doubled because inflation doubled, then all of a sudden you're making $60 an hour or $60 every day.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, I see what you're saying.
But you just couldn't buy it, so it doesn't matter what you call it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So that says to me that number means nothing.
Yeah. That took me a while to figure out what you were saying. Yeah,
sorry,
but I totally get it now.
Right.
And that makes sense.
But so I would posit that not a single transaction took place at $35.
Central banks.
Oh, so the central banks were getting gold for half price or 10th price, or right? So like that's the rub. That's why it was totally holding it steady is like was a gift to them.
Yeah, so what Bretton Woods said was actually the main point of Bretton Woods was not to technically redesign the international monetary system or like decide what the reserve currency was going to be. The first section of Bretton Woods founds the IMF.
Ugh.
Okay, so it was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development back then. That's section 1 of Bretton Woods. So Bretton Woods, it establishes the IMF, but it actually gives the member countries, there's 44 member countries to start out with, and it doesn't actually say you have to peg to dollars, and it doesn't say that you can't have your own gold standard, right? It doesn't say that, but what it does say is that each member country is to come up with a peg, either $2 or $2 gold. And after 1958, the US dollar will be convertible into gold. So if you're by foreign central banks only. That's why Murray Rothbard calls this a gold exchange standard. It's not a real gold standard because households and businesses can't turn in their paper currency for gold. It's only the central banks. And so whenever the central banks do decide to convert, there's a political game there, right? So Germany is friendly with the Fed. The Bundesbank is friendly with the Fed. So they're not going to call to redeem their dollars for gold as much. The Bank of England is friendly with the Fed. So they're not going to call the Federal Reserve and try to get gold out of them as much. It's countries like France who went rogue and decided, I think it was 1960, I think it was 1960. No. Maybe it was 1971. De Gaulle, the president of France, sends a warship to the New York harbor to, I believe, to collect balances of gold because the French central bank is accumulating all of these reserves of dollars, and they say, okay, it's been convertible since 1958. We would like some gold, please. And he actually sent a warship in order to go and do that, and they collected gold. So that was one of the problems throughout this era, is that France was not playing ball the same way that Germany and England were. And so Bretton Woods is basically all of the member countries, which constitutes most of the economic activity in the world at that point. So 44 members, they either peg to gold or they peg to the dollar. And these transactions are going to take place between the central banks in order to maintain these pegs. So if the dollar value of gold starts to drop down below $35 an ounce, then the Fed will buy some gold, increase the demand for gold to put the peg back up to 35. But as we know, that's not really what happened. What actually ends up happening is the other situation where the dollar price of gold keeps creeping above $35 an ounce. And so the Fed has to do all of these special arrangements to try to keep it down. And that's basically this quagmire that these 44 central banks and monetary authorities spend their time in for the next 2 to 3 decades. So when you read the Bretton Woods Agreement, so its stated goals are to lend to countries developing or rebuilding from the damages of the war, promote stable growth, right? So those are basically the two main objectives. The world has been ravaged by World War II, and basically this institution is going to be used to make loans to these countries that need to rebuild. But there's another way to look at the IMF, which is to say, actually, this is a channel for domestic and foreign tax dollars. So the way that the IMF works is that each member country has a stake, and that stake comes from a piece of paid up capital, which was in the form of gold, dollars, pound sterling, what is the German marks, French francs, all of these things. So each member has a stake in the IMF, and then the funds that the IMF uses to lend are ultimately derived from the contributions of the member countries. And the contributions of the member countries are ultimately coming from taxpayers, right? So the way that I look at the IMF is that it's a way of channeling tax dollars from all of the member countries to private institutions or government institutions that can't pay back their loans. And what ends up happening is they have those loans not to other governments, but to private banks. A lot of times private banks based in London, a lot of times private banks based in New York. So this is the long-term, what we'll go into detail in part 2, the less developed country crisis, Latin America in the 1980s. This is really what that story like. So you have these international banks that have lent to the developing world, and then they can't pay their loans back. And so the IMF comes in and says, we will restructure your loans. What does that ultimately mean is that the IMF is being used to make damn sure that the developing world pays back these bankers in London and New York.
Well, we might also, I have to refresh my memory, but I believe, if I recall correctly, that the IMF was giving loans to Ukraine that funneled through Kolomoisky's bank called Privat Bank. He owned Burisma. He also owned the TV station where Zelensky got his, played the president on TV. I don't know if you know Zelensky's ridiculous backstory.
I didn't know that, but I didn't know about this affiliation with the IMF. That's interesting.
Kolomoisky was affiliated with Zelensky, was affiliated with Burisma, and he had this Privat Bank. And from what I gather, the Hunter Biden thing, sitting on the board of Burisma and making a couple of tens of thousands of dollars just to sit there isn't why it's scandalous. It's that that IMF money that filtered through Privat Bank in the billions of dollars disappeared completely. So I don't know whose finger was in that till, but that might be a thread to pull on if you are looking to see like the barium or whatever you drink to like watch the radiation goes through your body to find the tumors and stuff. Like if you want to see how the IMF works, you might do the Ukraine, just follow the money in Ukraine and you can actually see where it ends up. So next time we'll talk about, especially if you're okay with a marathon, we can talk about de-dollarization, CBDC, and we can talk about the IMF and kind of international finance, the next era. When we come back, if that's okay with you. Did we leave anything out that needs to be right here?
Chronologically, the next thing that we're going to hit on is the Eurodollar market. So when it comes to the global dollar system, I hesitate to call it a system, but the global dollar state, we'll say, the Eurodollar market is a hugely important part of that, and not something a lot of people understand. So we'll look at that. How the Eurodollar contributes to things like the less developed countries' debt crisis in the 1980s, as well as the Asia financial crisis in the 1990s, and all of these different boom bust cycles. And then, like you said, we'll talk about, as far as de-dollarization goes, basically up to the 21st century, what that has looked like so far, and what's actually plausible, and then what is just Russian, Chinese, and Brazilian government officials complaining because dollars are getting expensive.
And can we talk a little bit about CBDC? Do you have a view on
totally.
that? Okay, great. Excellent. Thanks. That's super great. So just rattle off where people, I noticed that you had some videos. I particularly like the Irish dancing one, but it's not exactly on point.
It's probably the only one worth watching.
Oh, no. Is that true? Don't tell me that. I thought it looked like you had some good stuff out there in nice bite-sized pieces. So would you like to direct people to any of your work, or if they want to contact you with questions or to see how, however you make your living, perhaps people could benefit from your expertise. So say whatever you want.
Yeah. So again, really good place to find me is on Twitter. So I'm at SD-nomics. That's the letter S as in Sally, the letter D as in dog, and then nomics, like the tail end of the word nomics. You can also just send me an email at contact@jpurcell.me. So if you like email and you want to do it that way, and there's literally anything you want to ask about, just shoot me an email. Happy to do that. And then, I believe I'll double check, and if it's not, I'll post it. But my YouTube channel link is in my Twitter. So if you
I'm
just
go to put all this stuff in the show notes too. So and if you want to give me an email with all of that stuff in it, that'd be great, because then everyone can go to monicasdeepdives.com and find the post with the video, with the audio, and with all the notes.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll put my Instagram there too. I post a lot of I post some Instagram stories every now and again. If you want to learn about, if there are some financial concepts and terms that you've heard many times but maybe don't know what they understand, I've got a couple of videos about the yield curve inversion and what that means, and actually why it happens behind the scenes. Couple videos about Eurodollar futures. I've got one about like where interest comes from, that kind of, like we were talking about earlier, interest versus usury. So those are all on my YouTube channel if you get curious and just want to check it out. I've got one about CBDC. So I'm pretty sure that's everything.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, it's been awesome getting your
this has been
insights.
Fantastic.
Yeah, super, super fun. Not too many people you can chuckle with about financial history, but you might have reached the limits of my ability to get the jokes, but I do enjoy it. I think it's super fun and interesting.
I think we're far from the limit.
Yeah. Oh, you think so? You think we could? Oh, yeah. It actually gets funnier / not funny at all as we get along.
It will. It will. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's hope we can keep our sense of humor about it, and I'm actually stay on the line, as they say, because we need to set up our next meeting real quick. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks so much, Jason Purcell, for sharing your wonderful insight and research. And I just really enjoyed that conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next one. And thank you all for listening. This is Monica Perez.